Hello, my name's Mrs. Tyler, and we're here today to do some GCSE biology revision where we're going to do a knowledge organiser looking at biomass. Biomass is at the end of Unit 7 and triple GCSE, so if you're doing dual award, you don't need to do this bit. Today's knowledge organiser looks a bit like this. So we're going to look at the basics of food chains, pretty much stuff from primary school, and then we're going to look at biomass, pyramids of biomass, efficiency calculations, so the loss of biomass amongst the food chain, and then the effects of farming and biomass. And the farming and biomass, although it's a bit waffly, is the bit that tends to come up at the end of a higher triple paper. All right, let's get started. All right, so I'm going to put the title in the middle, which is biomass. And like I said, this is on triple science GCSE only, if you're doing AQA. I'm going to draw the line down the middle, dividing the paper in half. And then I'm going to divide it into 2/3 and 1/3, so a smaller section at the top of each half. In this section, we're going to be writing about trophic levels. Trophic levels, remember, are just stages of food chains. You'll have done that practically in primary school. Then we're going to be doing about pyramids of biomass. Again, just a short recap. Probably from Key Stage 3, so Year 7. Then we're going to go into the GCSE level content. So we're going to be thinking about the efficiency of transfer of biomass through a food chain. So the efficiency of transfer. And lastly, we're going to be thinking about food security. That doesn't mean locking your food up. It means making sure you've got enough food to feed a population. Just draw boxes around each of those. Let's get started then. Trophic levels then just means the stages in a food chain. And so if we were to draw a simple food chain, I'm going to draw a rose, plant. So we've got a rose. Roses are plants, so they can produce their own glucose by photosynthesis. So we call them producers. They can produce glucose, or food, by photosynthesis. The organisms that eat producers then are animals, and we call them consumers. And because this will be the first animal in our food chain, it's called the primary consumer. So in my food chain, I'm going to say that green fly, which are tiny little insects, often infest rose bushes, are my primary consumer. So primary consumers are animals that eat plants. We could also call them herbivores. But when we're talking about food chains, we use the term primary consumer. The animal that eats the primary consumer then are called secondary consumers. And in my food chain, that's going to be a ladybird, just because they're easy to draw. And ladybirds eat aphids. So they are an animal that eats another animal. They are a secondary consumer. We could also call them carnivores, sometimes omnivores if they also eat plants. And then my food chain has only got 4 trophic levels. My top one is going to be a bird. This will be called a tertiary consumer. And equally, if nothing else eats this level, this trophic level, then it could also be a top carnivore. Now, as it happens, birds can be eaten by other things like birds of prey and foxes. So in my food chain, it's not actually the top carnivore, but it could be in other food chains. The last thing is to say that the direction of the arrows in food chains is important. It always shows the direction the energy travels in. So it always starts with plants and goes up because plants are the start of the food chain. So the arrow shows the direction of energy. To pyramids of biomass then. Biomass simply means the dry weight of living things at each trophic level. So it's the dry weight. So let's again have a look at a food chain. This time I'm going to go up the page and therefore my producer is going to go at the bottom. So this is going to be an oak tree. I'm going to say it's a young oak tree. And let's say that young oak tree weighs 50 kilograms. Living on the oak tree are caterpillars that eat the oak leaves. Let's pretend that there is 0.5 kilogram of caterpillars. And equally, living on those caterpillars are a pair of birds, so 2 birds. And birds, although they look quite big, are actually quite light, so mostly feathers. So we're going to pretend that they weigh 0.2 kilograms. So if I was to draw this food chain as a pyramid of number, I would only have 1 oak tree, let's say 100 caterpillars and 2 birds. My pyramid of number would be a funny shape. I always put the producer at the bottom, and because there's only 1 oak tree, it's going to be practically a stick. Because there are 100 caterpillars, my next bar on my pyramid of number should be 100 times bigger. And then my birds, because there's 2 of them, should be twice as thick as my oak tree. So pyramids of number are often not a pyramid shape. It's better, therefore, to use the biomass, the dry weight of all the organisms in a food chain to look at what's happening to the efficiency in that food chain and the matter in that food chain. So although there's only one oak tree, that oak tree is really heavy. So in a pyramid of biomass, the producer goes at the bottom. I'm going to draw a line up the middle this time. And we should draw it to scale. I haven't got a ruler today, so I'm not going to, but I'm going to say that it should go out 2.5 centimetres either side of the middle, and that would show the weight of the oak tree. And I need to label it oak tree. In exams, you get 1 mark for drawing them in the correct order, 1 mark for labelling them, and another mark for getting to the right scale. Next up on my food chain is caterpillars. They're only 0.5 kilograms, which is 100th of the oak tree, so that's going to be much smaller. Again, I can't write caterpillar in there, but I am going to label it anyway at the side. And then lastly, my birds are even smaller still, so I just make a slightly wider bit there and label it at the side. So pyramids of biomass are always a pyramid shape. They're widest at the bottom because the most weight is always with the plant. And then as the biomass moves up the food chain and the caterpillar eats the plant, there are inefficiencies. And we're going to talk about this now. Biomass is lost at each stage. So each level of the pyramid gets smaller and smaller. So it's always a pyramid shape, or always wider at the bottom. Moving on to then efficiency of transfer. And this is how we explain why biomass is lost at each transfer between trophic levels. So biomass is lost at each transfer between trophic levels. And the reasons for that are things like light hitting the plant. During photosynthesis, only about 1% of the light is transferred to glucose, which is then made into protein or whatever else. So only 1% in photosynthesis. Only 1% of the light, which isn't biomass, but it is energy, is turned into essentially or used to make glucose. I'm going to put used. And that glucose can then be turned into DNA, cellulose, proteins, all the other things that the plant needs. So once we've got our plant, our producer, and it's grown, it's made its own glucose, not all of that organism is eaten. So not all of the organism is eaten. For example, in our first food chain, the green fly tend to eat the flowers and the leaves. They don't eat the roots, so the roots are left behind. But in potatoes, you eat the roots, but not the leaves. So we don't eat all the organism, e.g. roots. Also, even if you do eat all the organism, it's not necessarily digested. So it's egested, it's lost as feces. We don't class feces doing a poo as the same as excretion, right? Because it was never part of your cells anyway. So we say it's egested. So some cannot be digested. So it's lost as feces. And also, some is excreted. When we say excretion in biology, we mean it's gone into your system, into your cells, being used, and then the waste is being kicked out. So carbon dioxide and urea, that you breathe out the carbon dioxide and you wee out the urea, they are excreted because they were once part of your cells. So let's have a look at an example. So you could be given a food chain, you could be given a stage of a food chain, you could be asked to explain why all the biomass isn't passed on, why it's lost. So for example, let's pretend in a food chain, we've got mice as the primary consumers. And let's say that in a year, an owl eats 21 kilograms of mice. Not quite the same size. There's its beak. So although the owl eats 21 kilograms, the owl itself might only weigh 0.9 kilograms. So we could calculate the biomass lost easily by simply taking the mass of the owl away from the mass of the mice it's eaten. So the mice were 21 kilograms, the owl was 0.9 kilograms, which means it's lost 20.1 kilograms biomass in that trophic transfer, that transfer between primary consumer and secondary consumer. We can also calculate that as an efficiency percentage. Which equals the biomass of the second trophic level in your diagram, whatever it is, divided by the biomass in the first trophic level, again, whatever it is you're asked for, times 100. So in this case, it would be 0.9 divided by 21 times 100. So 0.9 divided by 21 equals that, 0.4 times 100 equals 4.3%. Food security then, as I said at the start, means having enough food to feed a population. So basically, we need enough efficient farming to produce enough food for everyone in an area. The problem is that the amount of yield from farming is affected by lots of factors. First one, as we've experienced in the UK over the last few years, is erratic weather. Caused by climate change, so droughts or floods. The next thing that's going to affect it is the presence of pests or diseases. Remember that plants can get diseases. So you know about tobacco mosaic virus and rose black spot as an example of a viral and a fungal disease of plants. They're also caused affected by socio-economic things like conflicts and war. And lastly, economic drivers. So things like changes in diet in the West. So in the US and the UK will lead to changes in crops in developing countries. So, for example, the increase in vegetarianism or vegetarian diet has led to an increase in the requirement for soybeans. So there's been an increase in the growth of soya. All right then. So there are a couple of things that governments can do to put into place to make sure that there is enough food to feed a population. In the UK, we have sustainable farming policies and laws, which means that although we might take from the environment or from the ecosystem, we need to make sure that the supply is maintained, it's sustained, it can last long enough. And the example that the exam board wants you to know about is the prevention of overfishing. So the UK is an island, and we used to have fishing rights for lots of the sea around the UK, and we would go, and as technology improved and the nets improved, we would increase the yield of fish that was taken from the sea. However, we took too much and fish populations started to drop. So one of the first things that the governments did was introduce fishing quotas. Fishing quotas are when there is a limit on the number and size of fish you're legally allowed to catch. Limit on the number and size of fish. What that meant was, though, is that some fishermen still caught the same amount, just chose the best bits and chucked all the rest of the dead fish back into the sea. So they didn't break their quota. There were also changes in laws and the size of the holes in nets, and they made it illegal to have very fine or small holed nets. So they had to increase the size of the holes in nets. So let's draw a big fish. So here's our big fish. He's been caught in a net. There he is, caught in the net. But because the holes aren't that big, small fish, young fish, can escape. They can swim out. So the younger fish can escape and keep the population growing. So younger fish can escape. They can just swim through the holes. We also have intensive farming to increase farming efficiency. So in terms of animals, unfortunately for them, that means we want to reduce energy loss to the environment. We want all the energy that they eat to be turned into meat and fat and produce we can use. So we want to reduce the energy loss to the environment. And we do it by what are considered as cruel practices by some people. So it's done by reducing movement. So keeping animals in small cages so they can't move around and they can't use that energy for movement so it's not lost. It's by keeping animals indoors. So it's warmer. So they lose less heat as less energy as heat. And it's things like their diet is often not what their natural diet would be. They might be given high protein food, so they put on more muscle mass, so they're going to generate more meat. In terms of plants then, we still intensively farm, but it tends to be through the use of fertilizers, which cause water pollution. And if you have a look at the human impact video, you'll see that it causes excessive algal growth, which leads to a reduction ultimately in the oxygen content of water and kills fish. So it leads to water pollution, runs off the fields and into the streams and rivers. And also pesticide use. So that's to kill weeds, herbicides, but also insects. And particularly, the killing of insects disrupts food chains. It means that other things get eaten instead, causing issues in other areas. All right, that's our knowledge organiser on biomass. You know your job now. Quick read cover recite and then have a go at some exam questions. And I'll see you next time.